From the sunny and warm Copenhagen, welcome to the webinar Keys to US ESCO Growth, Government Mandates and Risk Management, hosted by Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency. My name is Aris. I'm working as a program officer at the Copenhagen Center, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. A couple of things before we move to the main content of our webinar. This webinar is going to be about 60 minutes long, including time for Q&A at the end. In case you cannot stay until the end or want to get back to our presentations, all the materials and the recording of the whole webinar will be available online in a few days. Before we start discussing about today's topic, I would like to inform our attendees that we comply with the General Data Protection Act, also known as GDPR. This means that your personal data, such as name, email, workplace, is safely processed and stored, and all of your rights pursuant to the GDPR are respected. You have full access to the data being processed about you, and at any time, you can request that inaccurate data be deleted or rectified. For access or further information, please contact the people that are presented here. A few things about the Copenhagen Center. The Center conducts research and advisory activities in the field of energy efficiency and serves as Energy Efficiency Hub for the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. The Center has an established network of global, regional, and national partners with a broad range of stakeholders to help accelerate the implementation of energy efficiency activities. On regular basis, the global ESCO network will be conducting webinars. All materials, including the recordings and presentation from previous webinars, can be found on Global's ESCO network library under the webinar section. The material of today's webinar will be uploaded shortly, but until then, you can check the previous ones. Now, I would like to briefly introduce the speaker of today's webinar. Søren is working as senior economist at UNEP BTU Partnership. He has a PhD in climate policy with experience from 10 years of service in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Timothy is the executive director of the National Association of Energy Service Companies. In this role, he manages the representation of its member energy service companies. And Donald is the president of the National Association of Energy Service Companies. He has worked in the energy efficiency industry for 45 years as a consultant, entrepreneur, and state government official. Finally, I would like to inform that you can send us your questions during the presentations using the dedicate icon, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can at the end. Please do not forget to mention the name of the panelist that the question is for. And now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Timothy. So, Timothy, you have the floor.
Wonderful. So Donald and I are here to talk to you about how the U.S. industry grew from its early days and when it just started to what it is today. And the reason this is important is that we know there's a lot of markets that the global ESCO network represents that are really just beginning, and they're not as mature as what we have in the United States. And so we want to try to share what we've seen happen in our industry so that others can learn from that and perhaps shape their market to find success that we've also found. So we're hoping that that's what people will be able to glean from this presentation, as well as the chapter that we put into the Global ESCO Network publication recently. So we're going to give an introduction to our organization, the National Association of Energy Service Companies, or NAESCO as we like to call it. We'll talk about the different growth phases that we've seen. And then more importantly, we'll talk about what drove our market and why it did what it did. And then how technologies play a piece. Technologies, I think, a lot of times do have a part, but maybe they're not the focus when you're talking about market growth. And then risk management, a very key piece as well. So NAESCO is the trade association in the United States that represents energy service companies. We've been around since 1983, which is pretty close to the beginning of the energy service company industry in the United States. We have, it says 110 members, but we are growing quite a bit. We're almost 120 members today as we speak. 42 of the members are energy service companies, but we also have membership for what we call affiliates. And those are the companies that provide goods and services to energy service companies to make them successful. As you find, as you begin looking at the ESCO market, how an ESCO works, is they tend to aggregate the services from various other providers. Our affiliates are often those providers that they aggregate. In the United States, the market for energy service companies is around $7 billion annually of projects. In the United States, energy service companies have delivered a significant amount of project savings, $60 billion in project savings. And we've had a significant impact on the ability to keep our public buildings, which is the primary market that we serve, up and operating when the governments have just not been there to fund their maintenance. Projects that we do are primarily energy efficiency, but of late we've seen a lot of renewable energy. We've seen sustainability technologies, and we've also seen resiliency coming in to be a major project driver. In other words, the ability to keep buildings from being lost to some sort of a natural disaster or occurrence, but also to keep those public buildings recoverable in the event that you do have a loss. How quickly can you get the building back up online? I'm going to turn it over to Donald Gilligan, who's going to give us some of the history of the market and what's happened to us in the United States. Don, if you're online here, why don't you go ahead and take it away?
Good. So what I'm going to do is talk about the phases of the growth of the U.S. ESCO industry over the last 30 years. This graphic shows the way that the industry has grown. We have, as you can see, a pretty remarkable growth over the last 30 years. We have grown all the way through the recession, the financial recession in the early part of the last decade, and our growth continues to be strong. So the first phase of the performance contracting industry in the U.S. was when the utilities were ordered by their regulators, and in the U.S. we have regulation of retail utility companies by state. So it's a very dispersed regulatory regime. In the mid-'80s, the utilities were faced with very large costs for building new nuclear plants and new coal plants. And they looked around and they decided that they would solicit bids for what they called energy efficiency power plants. The utilities paid for kilowatt hours delivered, which was typically 80 to 100% of the project costs. The project monitoring and verification was designed to emulate utility metering. So actual installations in factories or hospitals were telemetered back to a central collection point. And if you can remember what the technology was like in those days, we're talking about dedicated phone lines with 300 baud modems. The M&V cost about 15% of the total project cost. ESCOs assembled turnkey service packages, which included the whole work in the project from the beginning of the project, the energy audits, all the way through long-term maintenance and savings guarantees. Most of the measures were lighting and controls because those were easy to monitor given the requirements for essentially real-time monitoring. And so the ESCOs targeted very high run-hour customers, industrial customers, hospitals, prisons, some schools that had very high run hours, typically more than 3,500 hours per year of actual runtime. The financing was done on ESCO balance sheets using shared savings contracts, which meant that the ESCO assumed both the project performance risk and the credit risk. In the mid-'90s, the industry went through a pretty profound change in a number of aspects. So first of all, customers became much more comfortable with energy efficiency technologies, and they didn't see a reason to pay the premium prices that some ESCOs were charging. A good example was that if you went into the late 80s or early 90s, ESCOs were pretty much the only people who knew anything about the new generation of fluorescent lighting technology. And ESCOs couldn't really even get electric distributors to carry this stuff, so that ESCOs would stock the materials themselves. By the mid-90s, the technology had migrated from ESCO warehouses to big box stores. So the customers, again, did not feel much reason to pay for the premiums that ESCOs wanted. We had federal and state governments across the US authorize performance contracts. They imposed savings mandates without capital appropriations. So the only way to pay for a lot of the savings mandates were with performance contracts. We saw the project development costs and risks escalate as the size of the projects grew. Utilities looked at the growing ESCO business, and utilities in many parts of the country were also subject to competition as the regulators broke up vertical monopoly utilities into their component pieces: generation, transmission, and distribution. So a number of utilities, maybe 50 or more utilities, decided they needed to own ESCOs. So they bought up the existing ESCO entrepreneurial companies. They started ESCOs internally within their own staffs. That trend really only lasted for about 5 years. So I think at the height, there were probably 50 utility-owned ESCOs. Today, there may be 5 or 6. There was also a new financing model. Guaranteed savings replaced shared savings. Guaranteed savings means that the customer signs 2 separate contracts. There's a contract with the ESCO to install the energy efficiency project and with the guaranteed savings. Then the customer signs a second contract with a finance company to provide the project financing. That effectively separates the technology risk from the customer credit risk and enabled the US industry to dramatically lower the effective interest cost on projects. From under the shared savings model in the early 90s, the effective interest rate might approach 20%. Under the guaranteed savings model, we're typically at 5% or less. And a number of banks and specialized financing companies moved into the business, so there was no more need for ESCOs to provide their own financing. And then the final aspect of this was that we developed a new M&V model. So NAESCO, ASHRAE, which is the Heating and Air Conditioning Engineers Association, the US Department of Energy, and a few other organizations got together and created the first version of the IPMVP system in order to satisfy the new entrants in the financing business that the calculations of M&V were reliable and transparent. Since the since the midpoint of the last decade, the business has really focused on public facilities. So industrial and large commercial customers were really discouraged from doing the kind of long-term deals that the ESCOs wanted because of the Enron debacle and the financial crisis. So there were sort of 2 hits. So as the industrial and large commercial customers really decided that they weren't going to do any more long-term deals with ESCOs, which meant that ESCOs turned their focus to public buildings. because the public buildings had a number of drivers: energy savings mandates, deferred maintenance. The estimates in the US market in public facilities is that public facilities need more than $1 trillion worth of capital investment just to bring them back up to standard code without moving to any kind of advanced energy efficiency or building electrification. These facilities don't really have any capital to invest, most of them, which means that the ESCO projects are very large. And our pitch to customers, to public sector customers, is that what a performance contract does, what an ESCO project does, is it repurposes money that you're currently spending on wasted energy and trying to maintain decrepit equipment into a payment stream that can repay long-term project financing. Our project paybacks now are typically 10 to 20 years. In some sectors like the federal government, they go up to 25 years. And ESCOs are adding technologies constantly to meet the new customer needs, as Tim said before. We've added distributed generation, renewables, storage, street lighting is a major business in the US. Water infrastructure, that means water and wastewater treatment plants, as well as the end use of water appliances in customer facilities. Utility subsidies help to pay for the projects, but they're not really the drivers in projects anymore. And this last graphic shows the growth in the various market segments over the past few years. As you can see, the total market is growing, and the market shares of the various segments, commercial, industrial, federal, housing, K-12 schools, etc., are fairly consistent. If you look at the red bar at the bottom, that's the private commercial and industrial market in the US. It's a very small fraction of the total market. Couple of other slides that illustrate what we've been talking about. This graphic shows the investment levels in projects in the various market segments. The vertical columns are time bins. So running from the beginning of the cycle that we've been tracking in 1990 all the way up to 2017, which is the last data that we have in the database. And you can see that in most of the market segments, the investment per square foot has increased quite significantly. Federal government is probably the biggest one, where projects are order of magnitude bigger than they were when the ESCO industry started. Next slide, please. And this graphic is another way of talking about our projects. Projects are much more comprehensive. This graphic shows, on average, again with the time bins in the vertical columns, the number of measures in a project. So in most of the market segments, we're doing more. We're doing 7 to 8 distinct measures in a project. The only lagging sector is the private, industrial, and commercial. Those customers are looking for very short paybacks, which means that they're looking only at a few measures, primarily lighting and controls, that can yield those short paybacks. This is another version of that same slide. data set that shows the what we call the dominant retrofit strategies in different market segments. Couple of things that I would point out to you in this slide. If you look at the K-12 schools, which is probably the largest single market segment that US ESCOs service, look at the orange bars running across in the center of the graphic. Those are what we call non-energy measures. So those are measures that where the project is actually driven by measures which either don't save any energy or have extremely long paybacks. For example, a new roof or new windows and doors in a school. And it gives you some notion of how much the school market, as well as some of these other markets, are focused on trying to use performance contracting to rebuild their facilities because they don't have the maintenance and capital investment money that they need. So that's the end of my part of the presentation, and I will turn it back to Tim.
So Don, before you go offline there, I joined the ESCO industry in about 1998 formally, dabbled in it for a couple of years prior to that. But, the things you mentioned are vivid in my memory. In 1998, when I joined the ESCO industry, our big push was we had to get all of our control systems to be year 2000 compliant. If you recall, we were concerned about the rollover from 99 to 2000, and all the software systems couldn't handle that change. So that was a big push my first year in the ESCO industry. But I do remember the M&V plans being very utility metering-like, with significant data gathering and time consumed to analyze data. It's very interesting to see that reminder you gave of the changes in the market. I also recognize the IPMVP, and I know you're on the board of directors for EVO, which is a significant organization that drives and maintains the IPMVP, which has had a major impact on the success of our market. So those are really great things to recognize as we go forward. And then finally, when you talk about utilities were buying out ESCO entrepreneurs, my first foray into the ESCO market was also at a utility-owned ESCO. It soon changed very rapidly. About mid-2005 or so was when the utilities seem to be walking away from that. And I think today we have very few ESCO-owned, utility-owned ESCOs in the United States. So I'm here to talk about major market drivers. And the subtitle of my piece here is Government Savings, Mandates, and Building Needs. My history is that I worked for the federal government in the United States for 10 years. And in that role, I ran a program called the Federal Energy Management Program. And government mandates and public facility needs were at the forefront of that program. We used energy savings performance contracts provided by ESCOs as a significant way to improve our government buildings. What we saw as the way that improvements happened was our elected body was happy to pass rules and goals for the federal buildings to accomplish some sort of an energy savings effort. However, they were not happy to give us money to accomplish those things. And so what we would get is we would get what were called unfunded mandates, meaning that the staff had to figure out ways with the existing budget to make changes in the way that our buildings were renovated to save energy and become more sustainable. And we had net zero goals, we had carbon-free goals, and so we had a lot of innovative things happen. In the U.S. federal government, we accomplished that through ESCO projects with energy savings performance contracts. The very last bullet on my slide here talks about the Obama Performance Contracting Challenge. During the time I was with the federal government, we ran a challenge to get the federal agencies to commit $4 billion of investment over 5 years of time. And that goal itself was a significant driver of success. And when we talk about ways to get government buildings to make this success, the way that was a success was the leadership of the government paid attention and asked for updates. And that's all leadership has to do. If leadership makes a goal and throws it out there and then walks down the path and never asks about it again, then we don't really see that progress happening. But if you ask about it, ask for reports, we see that progress will occur. And so that's one of the major ways that we had success in our performance contracting challenge. When we look at the federal government, that's one piece of our market. That's maybe about, I think we saw about 22% of the overall market on one of Don's slides. The other portion of the market that's larger is state and local projects, including K through 12 schools and universities. What we find in the U.S. is that these public facilities need a significant amount of capital investment just to maintain the buildings. Schools need HVAC work. It's common in public schools that the ventilation has been disabled or impaired in some fashion because either of a cost reduction or of a maintenance issue in the buildings. As we enter into the COVID age, all that impairment of that HVAC in our schools now comes back to haunt us as ventilation becomes key to trying to stem the spread of the COVID virus. So it's all kind of coming to a head right now with in the United States with this HVAC work. But public facilities needed a significant amount of work. Schools needed HVAC work. We've got a quote here: Illinois Public Schools has $7.65 billion in deferred maintenance, where deferred maintenance basically means that we put off work that needed to be done to maintain the building, and we cross our fingers hoping the equipment doesn't die on us or something doesn't happen. And what this causes is a lot of times when equipment fails in our public buildings, it's an emergency case. Middle of winter, a heating unit fails, you've got to have heat in the building. And so you have to go out and do a last minute procurement to get that in, which is often not the best approach to building renovations. So what the ESCO can provide is they can provide a more comprehensive, holistic way to improve the building and take it from its current state to a better state rather than just replacing a component here, a component there as it fails. There's little or no capital funding to meet these mandates. And the reason we see that is legislators love to pass goals for their public buildings, but it's just not flashy to spend money on those public buildings. No one wants to go home to their home district and wave their hands about the great spending that they did on the police station or the courthouse. They want to see things that help the general population more, that represents progress or innovation in their area. So governments have really driven our markets in the United States through these administrative actions. So performance contracting became a way of doing business. And so to make sure that those performance contracting had a pathway to success, we have standardized performance contracting project processes and documents in every state in the nation, as well as in the federal government. They're not all the same, but they do all have processes. We have competitive solicitations. A lot of states and the federal government maintain a list of qualified energy service companies, allowing for a more rapid procurement process to occur than might have occurred without that pre-qualified list. And then there's requirements that state agencies implement that says that performance contracts have to be cost effective. So we maintain a certain level of performance that's required. So then let's talk about technologies. Note that we say that technologies are not the key to long-term growth. We'll talk about why that is. If we think about the history of energy efficiency began as a measure of austerity, where we would cut back, cut off, and make things unpleasant in order to save energy. We would dim the lights or take out fluorescent fixtures. We would turn thermostats to make it cold when we wanted to be hot. We would turn thermostats to make it hot when we wanted to be cold. If we were driving a car, we would drive it slower than we wanted to drive it. And so efficiency, back when it began around the 70s and what it really grew in the United States, was really an unpleasant situation that we forced ourselves into to save energy. Technology comes to the rescue for us, and the ESCO market picked that up. Lighting came in, and instead of turning off the lights, we found that we had new technologies that could make the light energy that we were spending more efficient and give us not just more light, but better light. And so lighting drove the first phase of growth in the ESCO markets in the United States. ESCOs dominated the lighting market. They came in and they understood how this technology worked. When lighting first came out, I worked for an electric utility, And that electric utility had a demand-side management program and was installing this electronic ballast and this new T8 lighting all over the place where the utility serves. And what we found was that people did not understand this technology. Furthermore, the technology brought with it inherent problems. Power quality became a real issue, and ESCOs began to have the expertise to solve these problems and work with the manufacturers to actually improve the product and make it better. What's interesting about this is that these new products were often different. They might be a little more expensive. They might not be the standard run of the mill. And so distributors wouldn't warehouse them. And so ESCOs began operating their own warehouses with equipment. The company I worked for when I first joined the ESCO industry, we had warehouses across the eastern half of the United States. And my company was a small company with about 45, 50 employees, but yet we still had warehouses in about 10 locations in the eastern half of the United States. So the ESCOs dominated this market by bringing in the materials, warehousing it so it could be quickly distributed and installed. But of course, then the lighting manufacturers and lighting firms figured out how it worked. They learned. We made a more standard commoditized market out of lighting, and equipment began to become more normal to be stocked by distributors and big box stores. And pretty soon, ESCOs found that there was no reason for them to necessarily specialize in lighting. They either developed their own internal lighting specialty company, or they would go partner with one of these new lighting companies that was out there. And so then you have to have what's the next technology that drove the market? Well, HVAC and controls came along. HVAC and controls primarily was distributed by large companies, and the systems were proprietary, as somewhat they still are today. Large companies could come in and manage and finance the boilers and chillers and ventilation retrofits, and the market started to grow on these HVAC, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, and control systems, moving the market. But then, of course, mechanical contractors figured out how to do these energy retrofits. They started promoting themselves that they knew the energy side. And so energy service companies started partnering with the mechanical contractors. And now today, what we see is a lot of solar photovoltaic coming in. And we see that ESCOs were bundling solar photovoltaic in just about every project, was seeing some sort of a PV system installed, either on the rooftop or over parking. And the photovoltaic was not a good payback item, but you could blend it with other measures, and you could get it into a project, and owners wanted it. But then pretty soon the market came in and hit that as well. The federal government in the United States passed tax incentives to help the solar become more cost effective. Energy service companies found that there were specialty solar companies coming in, installing that. And so now ESCOs effectively go to those specialty solar companies and partner with them and put that solar photovoltaic in projects through those specialty companies. And so what we saw is these waves of a technology comes in, the ESCOs gravitate towards it, make a market out of it, competitors come in and specialize, ESCOs partner with the specialists. And that has gone through with lighting, controls, solar, and keeps going forward. So we talk about risk management. One of the ways that ESCOs find success is managing the risk of the project. What you find is that these projects have inherent risks associated with them. One of the biggest things you run into, you have to remember, is every ESCO project is going in and trying to renovate an existing building. And we all would like to say, well, we have all the drawings and know everything about the existing building, but that's generally not true. The drawings are out of date. The as-builds weren't quite updated properly, or in many cases, and most often what I find is the drawings just can't be found. And so when you come in and renovate a building, you have a significant risk just in the project itself. But there are certain risks that the ESCO business risk management has addressed. Marketing and sales is a really important one. I'm going to go jump to the very last bullet on that slide, where it says the second best first sales call is a quick goodbye. One of the things ESCOs have learned to do is to pre-qualify a project. We do that often through what's called a preliminary assessment. And what we try to find out through a preliminary assessment is this owner really interested in moving forward in the project, one, and two, is there really a project worth moving forward with at this site? And the reason that's important is that an energy service company has to often develop a significant portion of the project, spending their own time and materials. and money to develop a project that could, if it's a large project, could be several $100,000 worth of expenses before they ever get a contract to recover those expenses. And that's what's unique about ESCO business development is marketing becomes a massive risk management function in the company. You've got to make sure you understand who are you selling to? Do they have a legal pathway to buy what you're selling? Do they have a project at the site that makes it work? And more importantly, is the organization there and ready to accept doing a performance contract, which can be very invasive to the overall site? And it's a unique process that isn't like any other purchase that they've made. Contract and construction. Energy service companies have developed key expertise. Either they do it internal or they use outside experts. There are many experts in the market that you can go bring into a project and help you understand a project. And the other key, I think, is that we have recognized that ESCOs are essentially construction companies, and they should not overly rely upon design engineers to provide the services that a construction company needs, which is really construction project managers, construction site supervisors. And then finally, the savings and M&V piece is one of the key areas of risk management that you have, is after the project's completed to make sure that the project continues to perform. Clearly, making sure the project continues to perform is very key in the marketing and sales and in the contract and construction, as well as the engineering, but managing the savings M&V and the lifetime of the project is a long-term effort that spans often more than a decade. U.S. energy service companies use the premise and the structure found in the IPMVP, the International Protocol for Measurement Verification Performance, and options A, B, and C, which we won't go into the details of that right now, but the standard ways that you measure a project's performance. What's key is that ESCOs have learned in the United States that you don't go in and try to use a utility meter to measure all of the savings. You focus on the efforts that you do to save energy. So you guarantee units of energy, not the dollars, because the dollar rates can vary. You focus on the equipment that is installed, and you make sure that you have a way to evaluate the equipment installed, because an owner can change the use of a building significantly. We have ways to measure the operation and maintenance savings. We have to make sure that we understand the operation maintenance responsibilities. Who is responsible for maintaining the equipment? If you have a boiler and that boiler has an 83% efficiency performance expectation, but the boiler is not maintained properly, that efficiency will drop. Who's at risk if the efficiency drops? If the maintenance is the owner, it probably will be the owner that's at risk. If the maintenance is at the ESCO, it's probably the ESCO that's at risk. And so you have to have ways to make baseline adjustments and understand that, and make sure that you properly train the building operators so that they understand how to operate that equipment. It's key that when you deliver a report that you make sure a customer understands what the report says. So you need to spend time with them, not just send it in the mail, but you need to actually have a call with them. And you need to make sure that you have all the history of the project available. In the United States, we have a system that we're developing with Lawrence Berkeley National Labs and the U.S. Department of Energy called eProject Builder, which provides a centralized storage of project data and project information. So that's the end of our slides, and I don't know if we have any questions yet, but Soren, if we have some questions, why don't you bring them out to us?
Thank you very much both for your very interesting presentations. And yes, we received some questions, so I will ask from both of you to activate your web cameras so all the attendees will be able to see us. Thank you very much. Now, the first question that we received is goes like that. I understand that the American market has moved in waves over time. Where do you see the next waves coming? So, Timothy, Donald, who would like to start?
I'll start with that, and Don will correct me. So one of the things I see happening now is we see a lot more innovative financing and contract structures. In the United States, the energy as a service model, or basically the as a service model, is growing in popularity. As combined with that would be creative financing, and so we see those models growing, and I think that they're in their beginning stages. We'll probably see some changes in structure as buildings and owners begin to figure out how they like to see that. But that's my expectation that we'll see is that it won't necessarily be a technology drive that, but probably a financing structure or a contract structure.
Yeah, and I would say picking up on that contract issue, in the U.S., there's now a tremendous amount of money that's going out to state and local governments as well as school districts to try and renovate facilities to accommodate for COVID, make the building safe. So upgrading the HVAC systems, upgrading the plumbing systems, trying to address the neglected maintenance over the last few decades. What the ESCO industry is wrestling with is how to integrate those grants from the federal government into a full ESCO project, because the grants tend to be targeted. So, for example, there are grants now to upgrade the HVAC systems in public schools. Well, people who've been in the ESCO business for a while know that if you're upgrading the ventilation system, that's typically an energy penalty, not energy savings. And some of the recommendations in the US are, for example, that you run a school building for 3 hours before school starts and 3 hours after school ends with full outside air. Well, if you're in a cold climate, northern US, northern Europe, that's a huge energy penalty. So we're saying you can't just do those retrofits on their own. Those should be integrated into a project to retrofit the whole HVAC system, replace the fans and motors and chiller and cooler and boiler. That whole set of systems. So we're struggling with how do you integrate these federal grants into that financing.
Thank you, both of you, for the answer. The next question is, the US being federal, do ESCOs face challenges in dealing in different states? The US being federal, do ESCOs face challenges in dealing in different states, for example, in terms of regulatory differences?
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. As I mentioned, every state has a slightly different process than every other state. And every state believes that their process is the best process for their state. And so what you get is you get specialization within each of these geographic areas. We even run into differences in some states. There might be a difference between how the state does work and how cities and counties do work, and even how the universities in that state do work. So you can have not just 50 different state differences, but you might have 50 plus differences within the United States. Within the U.S. federal government, there's even differences from the Department of Energy contract versus the Department of the Army contract. And there's differences with how, say, the Veterans Affairs Administration does projects versus how the General Services Administration does projects. And then we have the added twist in the U.S. federal government that we have a slight twist on the market called utility energy service contracts in the U.S. federal government, which are significant, that are done by utilities operating like ESCOs.
Yeah.
Well, it's a great ball of fun.
So what we find in the U.S. market is that certain ESCOs decide that they're going to concentrate either on a particular state or a particular market segment in the federal government, for example, and they become really expert in that area and how the projects are procured, how they're financed, the technologies that the customers want, and they tend to dominate those markets. And ESCOs who just think they can kind of wander into a market and achieve success don't get very far.
No, not at all.
Thank you. The next question that we received is a little bit out of the context, but I'll mention it. Why were there no anti-ESCO movements by the building engineers, the bureaucrats in the American public sector?
Well, there are.
Who said that?
There are. We have been because the most of the regulation and the legislation involving ESCOs is at the state level. There are a number of anti-ESCO bills put up by state associations of architects or engineers. I think we have 3 or 4 this year that we are actively contesting. So it's a significant problem, particularly because ESCOs are going, because their customers need so much capital investment to make up for the deferred maintenance. The ESCOs are constantly trying to stretch the boundaries of the projects. And that really offends some of the architects and engineers who think, well, you really should just be doing, short payback energy measures and not all the rest of this stuff.
That actually was a very good question.
Yeah.
It comprises a lot of our efforts these days.
Yeah.
So United States is like all the other countries. They also have the anti-movement.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. And we have not only among the architects and engineers, but there's also a significant pushback in some places by unions.
Right.
Because, the union movement in the U.S. is pretty fragmented. It's not like in some European countries where they're industry-wide unions. In some states that we've seen legislation which would try to force all of the ESCO projects into union rules.
Interesting. Thank you. The next question, and we're getting close to our time, but I'll mention that. How could you imagine the ESCOs taking on the data centers? Or would you not think that the private sector would welcome them?
So I'll take that one. Data centers are a major energy consumer. And I think you have to think of the data centers as 2 distinct components. There's the actual servers and computer equipment themselves, and then there is the supporting equipment that surrounds the data center, which is building technology. And the measure of that efficiency is called PUE, where a PUE of 1.0 is desired, meaning that you have an equal balance of energy for the facility and energy of the data center. But what we find is that ESCOs currently do include data center measures in their project proposals. It's not that common yet, but it is something that ESCOs have proposed on and done work in. Most of the time, the ESCOs will focus on that building surrounding envelope piece. Since most of the projects in the United States are done with public entities, there's a challenge in trying to include too much operation and maintenance savings in a data center. So for example, if you own your own data center and you want to do an ESCO project, probably the most cost-effective savings way you could renovate that would be to turn it to the cloud and go to an Amazon Web Services or a Microsoft Web Services provider that gives you a bulk data center. And then the costs are significantly reduced because now you outsource a significant part of that. And so your savings are energy, but they're also savings that you have off of operation and maintenance that become challenging to claim in a contract at times. You can go in and do an ESCO project with data centers and replacing the CPUs, but I have not seen those projects happen at this point. Generally, it focuses on the surrounding infrastructure. But you certainly can, but an ESCO does not have all that technology knowledge now, and they would have to partner with an expert to provide that, which is certainly something they do. But I think you may see some challenges getting into that market in an ESCO industry of the data portion itself, but the building certainly would be very available.
Yeah, I'll supplement that answer with one story I heard some years ago from an IBM executive who was in the business of helping customers save money on their data centers. And he said, look, all of you ESCOs in the room, think that the way to do it is, as Tim said, you do the air conditioning system and the ventilation system, and then you replace the actual computing units with more efficient units. He said, we don't start that way. We start with what's actually on the system.
Right.
And what we found is that, for example, you go into a pretty good sized company and you look at, the basic promotional slideshows for the company. And he said, in many cases, we found that there are thousands of copies of those slideshows on the system. So the first thing you want to do is eliminate all the duplication, which means that you can eliminate a lot of the processing and storage capability. And that runs into what Tim was saying. In some ESCO projects, the ESCOs want to take credit for that as savings. And the customers have pushed back on that.
Right.
Thank you. One last question. I know we're running out of time, but we received it last minute. And the question is, could you see ESCOs move into off-grid options? For example, combining energy efficiency and renewable energy for public and private entities establishing their own captive systems?
Don, I'll let you take that one.
Yes. I mean, one of the moves in the U.S. is, on a couple of levels. So U.S. military bases are now required to be able to what's called islanding the base. So they have to be able to, theoretically, separate from the grid and operate for 14 days with no grid connections. That's an extreme example, but we see in a lot of other public facilities the need to isolate in the case of a natural disaster or cyber attack or any of these other kinds of problems which can effectively cut the facility connection to the grid. So we're looking at a combination of what are called microgrids for public facilities in an area, powered by renewable energy, storage, some backup fossil fuel generation, particularly for hospitals and other institutions which already have that backup generation. So how can we use it better and more effectively? So that, there's a very active market in that. The difficulty is, how do you pay for it? Because the basic ESCO marketing pitch is you can pay for the improvements we're talking about with savings. Well, there's not a lot of savings in a microgrid or storage, or so the whole equation has to change. We have proposed in the U.S. a federal program that would provide grants to public facilities for these resilience measures, which could then be packaged with the energy efficiency measures that the ESCO can finance with private investors. That bill is pending in Congress, but we think it's some version of that has to happen, because right now everybody wants resilience, but if you're a public facility that's strapped for money, you don't have any way to pay for it.
So that was the last question. Thank you, both of you, for the detailed responses to the questions. And ladies and gentlemen, finally, we come to the end of the webinar. I would like to say thanks to the panelists for the informative, interesting presentation, and to the audience for the active participation. So we hope that the presentation and the Q&A session would be beneficial for all stakeholders involved in the ESCOs and the energy efficiency. And thank you for your attention, and wish you a good day or night from Copenhagen.
Thank you.